All right, we should be up and rolling now. So yeah, the room's going to start to populate. I'm Chris Dial again here with a friend, a colleague, a family member in San Antonio now, Matt Nielsen, and we're going to get into sort of the evolution of becoming a coach. Matt's got a really incredible and unique set of circumstances and a set of experiences, and he's kind enough to share with us today his path and kind of what's brought him to where he's at right now. So, Matt, before we get started, I wanted to say thank you again, like while we're rolling live and recording, because it means a lot to me. It means a lot to the organization, and but also to all these coaches, man, that are all over the planet, stuck kind of the way you and I have been. It just means a lot that people like you are taking time out of your schedule to share.
No, thanks very much for having me, Chris. I appreciate it, and yeah, hopefully I can give some kind of useful information.
No question. I know you will. So, I'm gonna, guys, we're gonna, for those of you following and all the junkies out there that have been watching 5 clinics a day, we're gonna do this one more like a little bit of a back and forth with Matt and I, just kind of have a good conversation. And then I will encourage you, all of you folks that are watching this live, I know there'll be a lot of people catching the replay, but if you utilize that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, I'll do my best to get those questions to Matt, and we'll try to get as many of those answers as we can, primarily at the back end of the session. So, but we're gonna jump right in. I'm gonna get Matt to talk about a few things here. Again, he's not only played at the highest level, he's coached at that level. He's coaching there now, but he's bringing an incredible, unique experience because he is a product of an international, specifically the Australian basketball system, and he's played all over the planet. Now he's coaching right here in Texas. So, Matt, if you could, man, talk just a little bit about coming up in the game. That's the beautiful thing about this platform, is everybody's watching is in love with the same game that you and I are. So talk about coming up in that Australian system a little bit as a youth player, and then just let's go ahead and go through your timeline that way.
Yeah, all right. Well, started pretty much. I was a late entry into basketball, probably around like 13 years old. So, still fairly young, but I did a lot of athletics beforehand. But when basketball started to pick up in Australia, obviously I was pretty tall and really just fell in love with the game really quickly. And as that progression went on, and now I look back on it as the Basketball Australia program and what they used to call an ITC program, really exposed very quickly. And I think it's a great way to do it, where you kind of found in your state that you put in programs, and then it leads into the bigger umbrella of the Basketball Australia program as well. And I think it's such a good way, because there's up and coming coaches, there's the young kids, the talented ones, and I think they just come together. And as much as kids playing basketball is great, a lot of the time there's a lot of good camps and time to teach kids the skills that are important to move forward. And I guess kind of teach kids all the same thing, so as they progress through the ranks, they have an understanding of the expectations, and the goal is to get to the Olympic Games and represent the country, kind of thing. And so I kind of chipped away at that over time, and was lucky enough to experience all that pretty quickly between that 13 and 17 years old. Had a lot of great experiences with that, being from New South Wales all the way through to doing Australian camps and things like that. And lucky enough to actually play my first professional game at 17 as well.
And Matt, while you're just to add on that, while you're kind of explaining that, how different is it now? You've got a son. I don't want to jump ahead too much, but you've got a son that's had to transition from one youth system to another. I think a lot of the folks here in the States don't quite understand how deliberate the process for a youth player is in a place like Australia. Could you talk just in a little more detail about, you said you started a little bit late, but once they found you and they found this really tall, long dude that could run, you know, faster than most of the guys, uh, you know, how, looking back now as a coach, how, you know, how, what did they do to help put you in a position to succeed in your path?
Look, I think probably it is the system, the idea of a system for younger kids, I think is probably part of it. And I think that will change over time because, I mean, the evolution of basketball does. But I think the idea of, you know, spacing and using screens and really breaking it down. I remember, you know, just your simple pin downs as kids, and you'd be the screener. And because back then too, like as I was young, you know, that was transitioning. It was Yugoslavia, or they'd just broken up into, you know, Serbia and Croatia and things like that. But the Russian teams, they were these like like they were evolving from these pretty tall guys that would always be big guys that are now guards and things like that as well. And so just using screens, both being the screener, using them, and I think we would have camps where I felt like all we did was come off screens and learn how to use them. But it's just building a platform or a base to move forward. And I think that kind of stuff, just with your, like I said, basic spacing and rules of defense, I think getting to do that with good level coaches and other talented players while you're playing 1,000 games normally during the year were pretty big moments that, again, as a kid, you don't really think like that. You don't know what's going on. You do what's in front of you. But looking back, the structure of it, I think, was pretty good. And I mean, you only have to look. There's been a lot of good Australian talent come out. That there's a lot of programs that are obviously doing a pretty good job.
Yeah, no question. So I kind of interrupted you when you were getting into, you know, making it up until you were about 17. You're already playing with grown men at that point that are getting paid to play, and you know, those guys are supporting their families in a lot of ways. So that dynamic changes quite a bit from just representing, you know, a country in a you know, an international competition to jumping into a league where, you know, guys are playing at a really high level. So your path continued. Talk a little bit about what that transition was like as a player, and then as you started to get into your, you know, taking what you had been given in that youth, you know, segment, and then trying to apply it to whatever that next level is.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the irony of this is that people in Australia that watch me as a kid play, especially a young kid, I was pretty wild, would be fair to say. And I think some of them would have a little chuckle that I'm like in the coaching part. And I think that's part for me why understanding kids, like it's hard to, well, you need to understand that a 19 or 20-year-old kid is not like, he's evolving himself. He's trying to work stuff out, and you've got to put yourself in his shoes, what's going on, and where he's come from, and all those kind of things. And I think for me, I took on everything that was thrown at me, but I was pretty head first and probably not thinking as much as the next person sometimes. And I think for me, it's the way I knew, but it wasn't until I evolved into playing with adults so much, and the physicality, the taking care of your body, all these things. I got different teammates along the way that were really important in those things that become real, and they become real pretty quickly as you realize you get to the highest levels in professional. There's only little intricacies that change that person to the next, that team to the next. And you kind of don't understand that as a younger fella as much, but it doesn't take too much time until it becomes relevant. And I was lucky enough to have some good guidance from, you know, teammates and players, and then also coaches. We'll get into it a little bit later, but I had in my Australian time, so I left Australia at 24 to go play overseas. But up until that time, I was lucky enough to have probably the two biggest influences coaching-wise in my career, being Brett Brown, who most of you would know very well. He coached me for 3 years in Sydney. And then when Brett left and came over to San Antonio, Brian Gorgian, who's now been in China for many years, but a legendary coach in Australia, and both of those guys influenced me a lot and taught me how to channel some of that stuff. And again, I guess the basic parts of my basketball knowledge really and theories, I guess, come from those two.
I'm going to bring you back to those two guys, Matt, here in a second. And well, one thing I'd love for you to touch on is you talked about teammates making an impression on you. And as coaches, a lot of these folks that are going to tune in and watch this session are coaching in some capacity. You know, they're either working a youth program, putting it together, or they're coaching, you know, what we would consider here in the States high school age, or overseas, maybe U18, U20s. And then there's a lot of professional coaches on here as well. But I think a takeaway would be interesting is if you could share just a little about those teammates that impacted you. Like what were some of those characteristics that helped you in terms of what you valued in a teammate? I'm sure it comes through in your coaching now, but you know, especially as a player, what you really appreciated about some of those guys that had such a great influence on you.
Yeah, well, I think mainly with that initial part that I was just talking about looking after your body, understanding that, like, you know, the guy that was in front of me when I first played in Sydney was a guy named Bruce Bold, and his son Jonah actually played in the NBA recently and stuff like that. But for me, Bruce would just look at me and laugh and tell me I was kidding myself after practices, because I'd be running around and, you know, going at it, playing one-on-one. You know, sounds crazy, but sometimes trying to do stuff with my shoes off or whatever, and he's over there stretching and all of that. And he was really, really strong at telling me that you won't know when it's going to tick over and you need to look after your body. You need to start, like, putting in a bit of time now, and it becomes habit. And I can't probably admit that I was fully doing what he was saying straight after that, but it resonated with me not long after that it was something pretty important. And, you know, massage and ice baths and all those kind of things. And Australia's pretty good with sports science and recovery and all those kind of things. And I think it was, I did pretty well. I know over time I definitely put in the hours, but guys like that influence you. And I think, following on from that, it's something that I took pride in later on in my career, was knowing that I think players listen to players easier than anything else. And even as a coach, you need to really set up an environment where that's possible, where you instruct the players. But if you know you've got players around that are switched on, you need to empower them to be vocal to their teammates, because I do think the best messages sometimes can get passed from player to player, and you don't have to be afraid of that as a coach. You just need to probably empower it and be a part of it.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, and I think a lot of players probably have similar experiences where an older player, a player ahead of them on the totem pole, puts that in their brain, and it's a stubborn process sometimes, you know, where we don't want to do that initially, but eventually that light bulb clicks on and you're like, man, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let's go back to those coaches, and that's kind of what we're ultimately getting at here, because we're going to find out here in a bit sort of what drove you to become a coach or get into that process. But you mentioned the two big influences that you had, and of course Brett being one that's also kind of a household name here in San Antonio. Coach Brown spent, you know, a significant amount of time here as well. But talk a little bit about those guys, Matt, as coaches, you know, whether it be philosophy, whether it be style, whether it be, you know, relationship, but what were some things, you know, that impacted you in terms of those two guys in that relationship, and maybe even allude to, you know, some things that you stole, you know, from them that you wanted to make sure that you tried to do as a coach.
Yeah, I think definitely, you know, Brett was before Gorge, so I'll start with Brett. And he had such a passion for the game, but an energy every single day. And you can't fake that. There was such a, he lifted the room the whole time. He made you want to, you know, every day he wanted you to get better. He really instilled an environment to do that as well. And I think it's no big surprise why he's been so successful all through the ranks because of that. Personally, I know he probably had to deal with the wilder side of my attitude and stuff. I think Gorge kind of got me just maturing a little bit, but he really helped the game. And like I said, there was part of it would be the evolution of the game at the time, and trying to be a versatile big. I was agile. I could run around a fair amount, and I think I don't know, back then I was a four-man, so that definitely, where even with the post game, it was he really taught me a lot about squaring up in the mid post instead of just going straight back to the basket. Sorry, and I think I always think, even as I'm passing that on these days and teaching, I'm lucky enough to be around some pretty good coaches since then as well that I've watched development-wise in these areas. But he was the first one really with me about facing the basket, rip through, using my till I get some big fellas out there in it. Europe is always a more big.
Matt, you there? I got you.
Yeah, sorry to cut out.
Yeah, just a little bit. If you could repeat that last part, the audio got hung up a little bit.
I don't know. Probably, yeah. Just the big man moves for me was a big influence he had, and offensively being able to add that into my game moving forward when I moved over to Europe.
Gotcha. So you mentioned Matt, now being in a position to pass some of this along, and I don't want to skip too much, but can you kind of take us to the point where you were making that transition from player to coach? And this is, to me, this is a really interesting point in our basketball lifespans, because not everybody that plays ends up coaching. Not everybody that plays ends up being around the game in a formal capacity. A lot of guys, a lot of gals, they play, maybe they do it recreationally, but there's nothing beyond that. They go into a completely separate field or career, or whatever it is. But for those of us that find that transition happen from being a player to being a coach, talk maybe, Matt, just briefly about, is that something that you had in your mind while you were playing? And then, when you got to the point where you decided, hey, I'm going to do this, can you talk just a little bit about that trend?
Yeah, definitely. For me too, I think definitely, even from my time in Australia before the 9 years I went overseas, I definitely enjoyed being a part of the team, but also helping out the young fellas on the team and watching their development. And again, I think it was because when I first made the Sydney Kings roster, it was one of the oldest teams in the NBL history, average age kind of thing. So I was lucky enough, though, that I had a lot of good influences and experience to learn from. And I guess you always want to, even with the national team, didn't make the final team in those early years, but there was some of our best squads that we put forward at that time. And so always got it passed down to me, and I always felt like you're part of a line there, that your job is to then pass it along, the right habits and the theory of what it's about. And I guess that was something that was always inside. And so as I got in my later years in basketball, it was definitely something that interests me. And, I'd talk to coaches and be a part of different things. I watched the progression of players, and even some of them are still running around doing a pretty good job now. And so it's pretty cool to watch. But I guess for coaches or players that want to get into coaching, the big thing that meant a lot to me was I retired from basketball because I wanted to. I'd just had enough. I'd got everything I needed out of the sport. I'd loved every moment I had, but the day that I didn't jump out of bed ready to practice and get after it, I kind of knew that was enough for me, and I walked away from the game pretty happy. And I think my biggest thing then going into the coaching was, if I'm going to do the coaching, I want to make sure I'm in it for the right reasons, and it's not just a bridge to pass some time or anything like that. I wanted to coach, and I realized, been around some great coaches, and you realize that there's a lot to do out there, and whether, there's a lot of different rungs in the coaching field. But for me, I needed to make sure, if I was going to do it the right way, one of the biggest things, I was lucky enough to be asked, do I want to maybe just have a small role and help out with the national team or these kind of things. And I really didn't. And it was partly because when I do something like that, I want to be really good at it and ready for it. And obviously, as straight out of playing, I didn't feel like I was. And then the other thing is, I didn't want to coach mates, and it became like, with the national team side of things, I'd just been, in the trenches with these guys 9 months, 12 months before, and to try and coach them, I think it would be really difficult. It'd be difficult on them. It would be difficult on me, and I just didn't feel like it was the right step if I wanted to do this thing the right way and get to where I have my goals. And so that was a big part for me. And, everyone's got a different path and story, so it's no problem if people want to do it a different way. But it was really important for me that those decisions were made, because I wasn't a player anymore. I didn't want to be viewed like a player anymore. And I didn't really want to be the guy that they were like, oh, he could just go in and play if he needs to, kind of thing. There was no mixed emotions for me. I'd retired, and I was happy to be retired. And I think that was a big part. So getting on to the second part of how the coaching thing started, my last years were in Russia. I'd moved back to Australia, and I missed the sport, and so I was working out with the Wildcats boys a little bit, really just doing some light individuals. They had their own coaching staff and stuff, and I wasn't looking for a job at that time. I just was enjoying that interaction, but it definitely lighted the fire a little bit quicker than I thought, and really enjoyed it. But it really came down to a chance interaction. I'd come over to America on a little family holiday, and was catching up with Paddy, funnily enough, and RC, who's I've known since I was a young fella, and I'm forever grateful that he's always been, good to me and let me be around different things along the way, and we've interacted. But he asked me what I was up to, and I told him roughly what I've just already told you, and he paused for a little bit, came back, and we had a chat, and he just said that whether I'd like to be involved in the organisation. And I think he saw a spot in the video room that he offered. And look, to be honest, there was parts of just watching and being a slight part of the development side on court, rebounding and things like that, and then the video room, and just a big moment to me, to be honest. And we'll get into this a little bit later, but we went back and forth about it, because I was obviously going to have to move from Australia, and at that time I left my family to do that. That it came down to, the video room scared me. I wasn't even good with computers. I mean, my skill set was pretty much emails. And so for me to think about the video room in an NBA team and all of this stuff, and I was like, went back and forth. I was like, look, the job sounds great, but I don't know if I really want to do the video side. And RC just said, yeah, no, cool, I'm glad you're interested, but you're going to do the video side. And from that day on, it was the best decision and great vision by RC, because the amount that I learned that year in the video room, there was some amazing people led by Will Hardy, who's now a coach with San Antonio, and other brains in there, Dutch Gately and others. And I think just knowing what they learned and what they were seeing every day, and watching how they go about it, and just another facet. But as an ex-player, you'd watch video, of course, especially there's multiple years where you watch hours and hours of video, but watching how you pick apart the game and see things, and just the video became such a big part of my life. Watching it, learning how to cut it up, learning what to get out of it. And I know those guys put in a lot of hours teaching me, but it is a big facet for a player, I think, to make that transition was the video side, because you see the game differently. You can be more specific to, the pick and roll coverage or, zones or whatever, but then it's just the theory of watching the game from that angle and not watching it as a spectator and just watching the best player run up and down. I think was a big year for me in that area.
That's great. And I love hearing you talk about that process and that exchange with RC. For those of us that are fortunate enough to have been around that guy just a little bit even, we know, those of us in that kind of proximity know when RC says, hey, you're going to do this, you just nod, smile, and you do it, because he's probably 10 years ahead of where you are, even though it's your mind and your body. He's got such foresight and being able to, just so intuitive when it comes to that. But you and I both know he doesn't want to hear us talk good about him. So I'll stop. I'll stop now. Well, Matt, before we get a little further into the coaching part, because I would like you to talk here in a few minutes about you talked about that first initial experience. You ended up going back over to Australia and doing a little bit of coaching there later, and then found yourself back here, back in Texas, your second home, America's best version of Australia, maybe. But real quick, one question that popped up was, you mentioned, and I think it was incredibly insightful of you to know that even though you had an opportunity to work with like the Australian national team, you were like, I'm not going to go coach my teammates right now. I that's not something that I'd be comfortable doing. How, as the process unfolded and you got into the next few years, but how much has being a player, for as long as you were a player in the capacity that you were a player, how much does that help you, or has that helped you now in relating to players in their experiences?
Yeah, I think a lot. I think I touched on it earlier. The fact too that I think, unfortunately, in sport in general and basketball, guys can kind of be made decisions on their career pretty early if they're not locked in and switched on and productive early on in their career. And I think for me, knowing that I was probably lucky enough that whatever path I took got me through to, I could understand why a coach or a team maybe weren't as all in on it on the 19 or 20-year-old Matt Nielsen compared to 25-year-old Matt Nielsen. And it's only a small amount of time, 5 years, but the kid given a chance and a direction, like there can be a decent change and maturity come along. And I think trying to help players understand that, because some guys, naturally are pretty mature anyway, and they're like grown men at 19 and 20 and more mature mindset, and some aren't. And I think just probably understanding all those different types and stuff is a skill by no stretch that I think I've got covered, but I'm aware of, and I think it's something that is pretty important to not forget along the way, that they're still evolving in their basketball. You can evolve in your 30s, so there's no doubt that these younger kids, it's a big part that I feel like I'm okay at remembering and understanding and trying to put myself in their shoes along the journey. I think the other part for me too that it helps when you talk about thinking like a player is the kids, especially in my role here in Austin, is the kids are coming either from college or maybe have been a couple of years in a G League, maybe somewhere else. And there's always different things being asked of them. The way you play in college is not actually going to play in the G League or the NBA. And so teaching them these pretty basic things that are expected in San Antonio, because we're always obviously teaching them to be ready for the San Antonio side of things, is there's a lot of things that aren't in their natural instincts yet, and knowing that you can't take those for granted, so you can't go getting too far ahead of yourself with their development until they're pretty rock solid on those basic things, and not forgetting that, like, there's years in Europe where I had 3 coaches in a year. Now that is not easy, because you've got to think like 3 different coaches, and you've got to try and understand what they're after and things like that. But again, now when I'm a coach, it kind of helps you remember and understand what that felt like, and probably trying to verbalize and communicate that the best way to get them understanding you, and vice versa, as quick as possible.
That's great. So Matt, let's get back into the because I want to bring the audience up to speed in terms of, you know, where you're at now and what you're doing now. But there's still a little piece there, you know, as you transition through that opportunity with the Spurs the first time, you know, in the video room. Talk to us a little bit about coming out of that space with this new kind of knowledge and perspective, and what you did in the meantime, you know, to bring you back, like, because you've circled back and forth and landed back here.
Yeah, so my time after that, I went to back to Australia, to the Perth Wildcats, who are historically like the most successful club in Australia. They'd won the year I was back there, just in that the first year of retirement, they won a championship. The guy James Dennis, who's playing here and moved around teams, but was with Miami back then, drafted and put in Perth. So I did a little bit with them, came in San Antonio for that year in 14-15, and then took a role back following after that, the 16-17 season. And yeah, really just went in as a lead assistant coach, and an already successful club, and Trevor Gleason's the head coach. Guy named Adam Ford was the other assistant, who you know, over time I learned a lot off those guys. But Adam was just that guy that I think, like, talking about the grinding, the video, he helped me develop as well, funnily enough, in those areas, because I thought the NBA did a good job with stuff, but he did things. He was very computer savvy, and you know, taught me a lot of things about the video and that kind of stuff. So it really helped my development over there as well. And like I said, they were a successful team already, and to have the players that we did, we had like Damian Martin over there is, you know, the best defensive player that the country's ever seen in the NBL, and to just be around a bunch of professionals, it made my job as a coach a lot easier, because it was as much as I backed what I was doing, the group was kind of self motivated and were already at that level. And so it was kind of good, because as a coach, you really would just put in those finer intricacies on touches in whether it was the scouts or just the general player development and those kind of things. But great group of guys, and like I said, self-motivated. And we were lucky in the 4 years I was back there we got 3 titles, and it was really I always feel like for a 4-year hit, I got everything I could have hoped out of it, and great experiences, and like I said, I learned a lot.
So Matt, talk about coming back to San Antonio, or to the Spurs organization, specifically Austin, in terms of you know, basically, I think a lot of the coaches watching this now, any part of learning a little bit more about what the G League, you know, is, and its relationship with the NBA, but specifically in your path, as we've gone from young Matt Nielsen to, you know, getting us up to current Matt Nielsen in this big, you know, kind of path and collective experiences. So maybe talk to us a little bit about coming back here, and then your role and involvement with the Austin Spurs, and maybe we can get into some back and forth about the organization there.
Yeah, so like I was lucky enough through those the whole time that I was in Perth, that I would come back in the off season, and I'd spend time just watching You know, if the season was still going, because the Australian season finishes fairly early. So a lot of the time I'd come back over here and they were still playing, and I'd just watch and learn a little bit, and then was involved with the summer leagues throughout that whole time. So being a part of that was fantastic. I mean, I'm always very thankful that I'm even given a chance to pop my head in the facility, let alone be a part of some of that stuff. So that was always good, and kind of, you know, you took different things out of it along the way, and you watch the development, you know, over that time. You know, I'm talking since 14, 15, the kids that were drafted, but being a part of their summer leagues and watching their development. And obviously, again, very similar with the RC factor, you've got Chip England, who is just literally the best in the business at developing players and their skill sets. And I'm very careful. That's as much as I'm going to say, because I'm sure he doesn't want me talking about it very much. But you know, just being able to be a fly on the wall around him has been such an important part in my development as well. And so I guess always wanting to be back in this environment and getting the opportunity. RC and I have spoken over time about that stuff, and yeah, an opportunity arose this past year to make that big decision. I'd be remiss not to talk that I'm lucky enough that my wife has supported me through this whole thing. And you know, I've asked my wife and 3 teenage children to make this big move from Australia to here, which is not an easy thing to come to Austin, especially in this current environment with Corona, where we're pretty housebound in a foreign country and all those kind of things. So I'm forever grateful for that. But yeah, I guess getting the opportunity to come over here and be a part of the G League, and then I was an assistant coach this last season, and just watch and be a part, I guess, like of the development of these young guys. And I think I'm lucky because I have been around the franchise for quite a while. I have enough knowledge of the expectations and what it's about. But I mean, the Spurs, San Antonio and Austin are so close and bonded by, you know, the wants and desires of the San Antonio side, and the job that we're so backed in Austin. And I'm pretty sure not all clubs feel that in their G League sides, but the way that we're supported, and the players know that there's a direct path, the runs are on the board. There's the players that have been down here, even from my time. I had Kyle Anderson was a guy that was drafted the year I was in San Antonio the first time. There was Jermichael Green, Jonathan Simmons, Bryce Cotton. So there was a lot of talent, but they see the path that can happen from those things because it's real. Because you can say as much as you want, the proof is in the pudding. And I think that was pretty a big sales pitch for me too, knowing that like there's such a backing from the San Antonio side that the guys, it's real, and the job was everything and more when I got here and was a part of it.
Matt, can you talk a little bit about, you know, the Spurs have such an incredible organization, an incredible system. I think a lot of the coaches out there would love to hear, you know, so when you guys are working, let's say you're up in Austin and you're having, you know, X amount of practices a week, maybe even just allude to that, like what a tip in season, you know, kind of what that schedule looks like. But as you do that, the overarching thing is, you know, what are you impressing upon these guys, not just on the court, but maybe talk a little bit about off the court to prepare them to make that jump to the Spurs, because you and I both know the Spurs won't take anybody. You know, you've got to have certain boxes checked. If you're going to get in that facility and practice every day and assimilate to that culture, you're going to have been prepared. What would you say maybe are some of the more pillars, you know, the concrete things that you've got to have as a player, and how is the Austin franchise helping, you know, players do that?
Yeah, look, I think it's all about balance, because for me, kids want to get better, like I know the ones we're lucky enough to be exposed to, that they all want to get better. They're there for the right reasons. They want to, the G League naturally is a development league. Nobody is growing up wanting to play in the G League. It's a path to get to the places you want to get to. And I think understanding that the players will come in ready and raring to go, and feel very fortunate for that side of things, that you want to help in their development. Now it comes down to breaking down, like, that's great, but that's pretty broad. And it's about, there's a direction for each player. That's natural. And obviously the assignment guys or the two ways have a very clear path that is decided, from the powers that be. And you want to be a part of that. So, whether it's a shot, a part of his shot, or, off the dribble, or those kind of things. And I think that's for another kind of bigger conversation, or a more defined in a funny way. But I think the pillars that you're kind of talking about is understanding that none of these guys are just going to walk into a starting role down in San Antonio, or however you want to look at it. So it's making sure that their basics, defensive understandings of the rules, because obviously Pop's so defensively orientated that if you're not switched on there, you're not going to survive too long, or minutes definitely are not going to be flowing, and getting them to be rock solid on these basic things, where they're developing as a basketball player that they want to be, and finding that the minutes balance, I guess, in practices, and also when you get them in video, and then development in the game, is why they're worried about, because they've missed 3 shots in a row, is just reminding them that what they need to be solid in first is these other things. Sometimes I've watched guys that I thought that did a great job in the season, and they come off angry because they've missed those 3 shots or whatever. And you have to really, because I really believe what I'm saying is, you have to teach them that, yeah, but you're going to stay on the court if you can do this, like that kind of body of work on the defensive end, and those things will take care of themselves over time. And I think finding that balance with those guys, that not to, and I think as a coach too, there's so many ways to do so many things, but the basics are the basics. And I think that just your basic shift positions, pick and roll, like the way you fight over screens, or bigs, hand activity, all these things are so important, and the development, and it's probably narrowing down the big picture for these guys is something that I enjoyed, and you kind of see the benefit of. And the day that they start seeing those things is a pretty, it's a good feeling as a coach when they start to pick those things up.
It's funny that you said words like fight and words like activity, because those are words that, if you're fortunate enough, like you mentioned, to be in a pop practice, you hear those words quite a bit. Fight, activity is such a big thing offensively and defensively in the Spurs system, is, just that ever constant movement and purposeful movement, and kind of being where you're supposed to be. So,
well, I think one of the things too with the G League is, like I said, not every team is probably handled the same as San Antonio, and we're very fortunate. But I think one of the biggest adjustments for players, but it's a good skill to learn, was we're pretty free flowing and all, but there's an amount of structure, and there's the stuff that we want to play the game the right way and execute what we're trying to get out of a game. And sometimes it's a pretty free flowing game in the G League, and teams run up and down, and some of them don't have much care. And I think trying to teach players to stick within what we're trying to do in the middle of that is a kind of big ask sometimes. But again, when it's achieved and the guys kind of get it and see that we can still kind of play free, but we've got to stick within some kind of system. When they see how that works against those kind of teams, it's beneficial. But sometimes it's a pretty good test, but it's kind of helpful.
We're getting in kind of like that last 10 minutes, and I want to make sure that I give you some space for any kind of final thoughts. But we did have one question from one of the coaches, and it kind of leads into, or it could attach pretty easily to what you're saying without getting into crazy detail. Like you said, these guys would probably have you on 10 more times to hear about what a practice looks like, hear about pivotal development tools, hear about, just all the things that you guys do. But if you had to describe, you just mentioned, one of the things that's always been fascinating for me is the Spurs do have a system, but there is freedom in that system. It's what you're talking about. Could you allude to a little bit, I mean, obviously without, not bringing the playbook out, but is it fair to say that like an Austin Spur, if they catch the ball on the right wing after a ball reversal, they kind of understand what subsequent actions would look like? Can you talk just a little bit about how, as a staff, you guys don't just preach and teach like this is what you do. It's a lot about this is kind of how you play. So then your actions have to, I know, Spurs don't like it when the ball sticks to a player. They're not trying to be extremely ball dominant. Can you talk just a little bit about maybe some of those things that are coming out of the staff's mouth to put them into that system, mentality?
For sure. And I think that's the other part too, when we're talking about player development is probably terminology. And it's something that I've learned along the way, and it's very valued here in San Antonio, as I'm sure it is around the place. But you realize as a coach, even in my transition, being clear, very clear in what you're asking, and then obviously making it punchy. So sticking with vocabulary is pretty important, and I see the real benefit in it that I maybe didn't understand as much as a player. And I think that's something that you have to kind of be on point a bit with over time. But because obviously I was involved with other clubs and teams along the way as well, so you may use and Australian American kind of terminology sometimes as well is different. So making sure you're really tight with that, because again, you're trying to make it as clear and simple for the players. And so when you talk about that, there's different terms for, getting off the ball. There's different terms for getting to the right spaces. But there's no doubt in what you're actually asking as well, that it is the theory of basketball in a lot of the parts. So you can put any plays you want or adjustments to it. But there is certain times when plays are broken and a player is going to make a play that you want to have good spacing. And I mean, spacing is so underrated in my opinion. You can have the best pick and roll set up to your offense, but if you've got two guys after that standing in the wrong spots, the defense is going to interfere with it and so on. So spacing is a huge thing. And that, again, it's not always about the exact play you're running, but just in general, having the right spots, and when a drive's made, getting to those spots and the terminology that goes with it. Getting off the ball is definitely, like you said, a historically Spurs theory. Which creates great basketball with ball movement, and obviously defenses don't get to lock in on one player when the ball's moving so much. So definitely different things like that become very important in the overall development of the guy. Again, because kids are just going to take different parts of information and go wherever they go with it. But I think laying that foundation is so important, and they're at that age, like, they're one of the hardest problems. They're so skillful too that you kind of think they may know more, or their whole foundation is rock solid, where sometimes their skill level is fantastic, but there's definitely room to keep developing even in those smaller areas.
Right. Matt, you mentioned earlier how much Pop predicates so much of the plan on defense, and he's very orientated defensively. In an Austin season, what percentage of time would you say that you guys actually spend working on defense? Knowing that these guys, if they are called up, if they do move forward, that's such a big piece of what they're doing.
Huge amount, to be honest. I think for me, in saying that too, we had two assignment kids, Lucas Amanich and Keldon Johnson, the whole year practically. And then we had the two-way guys and assignments along the way, Chimezi Metu. So you really want to give them a helping hand for when they're in San Antonio, and understanding that, again, the guys aren't going to be in the starting five straight away when they get up there or anything like that. And then knowing the expectations, it's all defense. It's all the the icing on the cake will be if they contribute offensively in this exact next year or the season that we're in. But defensively, can they be rock solid and perform and give Pop the minutes that he needs? And it helps them development and also helps them stay on the court, which is, I'm not going to lie, I used to love watching when one of those guys had gone to San Antonio and is playing, and it's only natural you've been with them and you watch them get their chances. And so knowing as a coach and still thinking like a coach, if they're being rock solid and that, it's going to give them a chance to stay on the court that little bit longer. And that's part of it. And I think those guys really understand that.
I was at the last game, that we got to play versus Dallas, and both of those guys got in that game and played a good chunk of minutes. Keldon was guarding Luka and did a really good job on Luka, as well as good as anybody else can, So you guys are a testimony to all the things that you'd been doing with those guys. High potential, high ceiling players, both those guys. Matt, as we kind of wind down in the last few minutes here, is there anything else that you want to, kind of leave or impress upon these coaches, or any gaps I left out in terms of your timeline? I think this has been an awesome conversation, but I wanted to give you a minute or two if you had any.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I guess for me, this is really, I don't know, people get that much out of it. I appreciate you taking the time and asking me, but I think I can only speak for me in coach development or learning to be a coach. That the things I've taken out of it, and lucky enough to be involved, like I said, with such an amazing club, and forever grateful for that. But the one thing that I've tried to take out of it along the way is the amount of people you get to meet. And like I said, the summer leagues over the last 6 years that I've been a part of, I mean, there's a million coaches in those venues, and you bump into them repetitively. And, I've been lucky enough to go to a camp or two, and even you see them now during the season as well. And just talking, and I love the fact that there's so many people that are willing to talk basketball and chat about certain things. And I think it's such an important part to, I don't know, you just share your interests, and you can ask pretty pointed questions sometimes. And it never hurts to listen. It never hurts to ask questions. And I've really enjoyed that side of things. And I know in this situation with Corona, everything's become Zoom and webinars and those kind of things. But I think that's also, I know I've really enjoyed probably taking a deep breath from other stuff and then getting to see, this platform itself and all the great people you had on there. Now, I end up just being on here talking about myself, but there's been just great things with pick and roll coverages and, different things where you don't always have to agree with things either, but it's hearing the perspective. And I think sometimes you got to be able to change things up anyway. I don't think you should be, one of my beliefs is not to be too pre-planned that you can't do anything else, or you're not open to other ideas. And I think that's probably been the best thing for me, is just the hearing when people were delivering a why. And the why, I think, is kind of important to hear, and then that makes you think a little bit differently and probably adjust things sometimes.
Well, now you said it, and Matt, you're too humble, so you won't admit to this having an impact. But I think you've said some really powerful things. I think a lot of coaches right now are reflecting, just because of the nature of the times. We've been taken out of the office, we've been taken out of the gym. I know me for sure. I've had a chance to sort of reflect. Think about some of the more intangible ways of revisiting my own path, in coaching and all this. And I think hearing somebody like yourself, you're in a position, a very fortunate position, but one that has been earned. And, even the tidbit at the end, just about how, relationships are, and how being a stakeholder in relationships and not being fearful of asking questions, and, being inquisitive. And I know I've heard Pop say, be curious, and just, those are important. Those are very important things. So I think people that watch this, they'll get plenty out of this. And you doing this again, especially during this time, a house full of kids and a very patient and understanding wife, it means a lot to us for you to be here And Matt, before we sign off, man, I do want to plug, one more time, our friends at Spurs Give. That the organization it's a huge organization with, multiple parts: basketball, business, and then the nonprofit side. But the Spurs Give have done some incredible things here in this community that you and I were talking about before we hopped on. And I want to encourage people that this was a free platform. Guys like Matt are taking time to do this out of the kindness of their heart. So if you're able to, if any of the participants are watching, please go on the site and throw a donation at Spurs Give and help them, continue to positively impact our community through the sport that we love. So, but Matt, thanks again, man. Thanks so much. It means a lot. It's great to see you, and look forward to all the things, hopefully that'll happen sooner than later up in Austin and with the Spurs, in the coming years.
No, thanks very much for having me, mate. I do appreciate it, and yeah, keep doing the good work. Because, like I said, I really appreciated watching a lot of the great people you had on there. So, all the best with it, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Matt. We'll be in touch, man. For everybody else, you guys have a great day, and hang in there.